Good afternoon, friends. I have been asked to reflect on the Tunisia Operation, and I have tried to avoid making that a mission debriefing, which would have probably taken 2 hours and gone in the nitty-gritty of what went well and what didn't go so well and why that was. And I tried to find some more general lessons which are applicable, according to me, to all responses to complex emergencies, many of which I was part of throughout my career, and many of which are affecting all of you in your daily work at the Secretariat or in the fields. First of all, I would like to hint at the fact that I have provided you with 3 slides. The first of which briefly recalls the exceptional wave of popular uprising that spread through Northern Africa, starting in December 2010 and still continues today. I think we must keep that background in mind, and I would have loved to project it behind me, but for practical reasons, that is no longer possible. So please have a look at it while I am talking. We must keep that background in mind. Surprisingly dynamic, it caught many by surprise, rapidly evolving, incredibly fluid, to understand the Tunisia operation. It's not an operation in a vacuum, it never is. Okay, it's always within a context that determines it. Without going further into the subject, it is significant to remember, I think, that Tunisia had just ended its own revolution. A month before the crisis started in Libya. And it had overthrown a 23-year-old regime. In other words, its normal structure, which it had known for 23 years, was no longer functioning. In fact, a lot was dysfunctioning. The police force was hardly present. The military were looking for a new balance. All kinds of new parallel structures were being tested, started, but were not yet in place. And the humanitarian actors on the ground, in the field, they all had to work within that context. And I think it's also important to bear in mind that all the actors had to keep their options fully open, because they were facing the possibility of having to respond to very large numbers of internal displaced and refugees, not only in Tunisia, not only in Egypt, but actually in the whole of Northern Africa. So if you have a look at the operation, the Tunisia operation itself boils down to a humanitarian response to the needs of large numbers of individuals and families who fled the conflict in Libya for a variety of reasons. And those reasons, they range from pure security-wise to economic reasons. We are talking about a refugee crisis, a displaced crisis. The Tunisian government doesn't like to call them refugees, you might know that. They prefer to call them persons in transit. Therefore, the title of this presentation, Transition in Turmoil. Persons in transit, since most of them would be repatriated by IOM, which is happening now. The situation in Tunisia was complicated by the fact that in the group of displaced people, there were more than 30 different nationalities. They were belonging to very different cultures, from sub-Saharan to Asian to Arabic cultures, and those cultures, they do not always mix well. The vast majority of beneficiaries were young men, migrant workers. Smaller numbers were families. Even smaller numbers were individual women, and obviously, some of those would have very specific needs for protection. Some of the beneficiaries had suffered violence, including gender-based sexual violence. Many had lost belongings, and quite a number of them had already originally left their country of origin as a result of conflict. There were quite a lot of Somalis, for example, amongst the beneficiary population. More than 40,000 refugees had arrived when the Tunisian Red Crescent was asked to intervene by its government. Some 12 to 15,000 of them had absolutely nowhere to go and were stranded, partly at the border, but mostly around an existing military medical facility, which is called Sousha Camp, and that is at 8 to 9 kilometers from the Ras Ashdir border only. At that time, the army, the civil protection, UNHCR, IOM, UNOCHA, and others were trying to bring some order in the chaos that resulted from too many people arriving too fast in an unprepared situation. Resources were virtually absent to support them with food, water, accommodation, sanitation, or any kind of health support. And UNHCR could actually little do more than mobilize resources wherever they could find them, including from a very generous part of the local community. And then they would distribute whatever they found as rapidly as possible to those who were already waiting for assistance. Quite rapidly, a camp grew in place, was not constructed in place, no, it grew in place. Not based on a formal master plan, but rather as a result of many disconnected initiatives taken by individual organizations, individual actors, often by beneficiaries themselves. One could speak about a wild growth of a camp. And it would really take several months of reconstruction and reorganization to improve the layout of the camp and the safety of the beneficiaries. Dear friends, I really want to stress that no criticism at all is meant from my part towards any of the organizations that were forced to intervene, since they all had to intervene under the constant pressure of new arrivals, under an enormous time pressure, and in near impossible conditions. Okay, so we can state facts, we can see weaknesses, but that's a very different issue than blaming anybody for those weaknesses. There is no doubt that the situation made a very strong impression on our initial assessment team, led by Karl Löwe in those days, as it arrived at a time when the chaos was actually at its height. One of the key architects of our initial response compared the situation to hell in an interview. And those of you who know Karl Löwe, they know that he is not very likely to use that kind of statements in public, but he did. He obviously was seriously shocked by what he had seen. As the different actors were already overstretched in coping with the existing numbers of refugees, and as the size and speed of any further arrival of even more refugees could not be predicted, a proposal was made to construct an additional transit camp, fully managed by the Tunisian Red Crescent, with support from the Federation, the Finnish Red Cross, and a range of regional disaster response team, emergency response units, and effect. In all, some 20 Red Cross and Red Crescent societies would support the effort over time, coming from all over the world. That camp, later on named the Hayet camp, was supposed to open only as the capacity of the Susha camp, the UNHCR camp, would be depleted. It was defined as an overflow camp, a contingency camp. In parallel, TRCS volunteers would continue to assist UNHCR efforts at Susha with the preparation and distribution of food, the distribution of non-food items, support to the construction of latrines, hygiene promotion, and actually a large range of other activities. And to provide at least some comfort and protection for them, especially at night, a base camp was to be constructed by the Danish Red Cross, and that camp was then situated in between the Susha and the Al Hayat camps. If you look at the second slide you will see the overview of the situation. You have the border. Then a bit further, you get the first camp that is put up by the UAE Red Crescent. Then you will see the two camps, TRCS Federation, a camp that is a transit camp and a base camp. And then further on, you have the Susha camp, which was run by UNHCR. All of that from the border to UNHCR, you are talking about 8.5 to 9 kilometers only. So it's all quite cramped together on very short distance one to the other. Now, thus started a two-pronged operation, part of it focusing on assisting UNHCR in Susha, part of it providing a parallel structure, the Al Hayat camp, which is still open today and has since served a bit more than 6,000 beneficiaries. I myself was asked to replace the outgoing FACT team leader 3 weeks into the operation. I remained there for almost 4 weeks, and my main contribution has been not to construct the camp, but to redefine its purpose and to rapidly open it for beneficiaries for a limited number of nationalities. from a different, limited number of nationalities. So much for the operation. So, is there anything we can learn from it? If you allow me, I propose to highlight 4 topics, which I believe are crucial for the response to any complex emergency. First of all, the importance of having a real, in-depth assessment before launching a major operation. That is important in any case of a disaster, including natural disasters, but it is particularly important when we are talking about complex emergencies. Secondly, the question of whether we should focus on strengthening the existing and thus on cooperating with others, or should we focus on trying to do better and thus rather work in parallel, perhaps in addition, but perhaps also at the risk of duplicating efforts? The question might seem simple, but in fact it is not. And it is also not an either-or type, as you see in the Tunisia operation, where we decided to do both, and both at the same time. Both supporting, both cooperating, and duplicating in parallel. Both has happened there. Thirdly, I would like to discuss the importance of planning from the start of an operation for its phase out. So starting to plan for the end at the very beginning. And in the end, I still would like to say a couple of words of the importance of multiprocessing and multitasking in the implementation of a complex humanitarian effort. And I'm sorry that Ed Hupp from ISD is not here because he would have loved what I had to say about computers today. Ladies and gentlemen, it's common knowledge that starting a humanitarian intervention without an adequate assessment is almost a guarantee for failure, unless one is very lucky. In the case of a complex emergency, the devil is often in the detail, and an assessment is usually very tricky. Certain aspects of a complex crisis will always be kept sensitive and kept secret, and one will need to sift through layers of information to discover the relevant information one needs. It's a process that can be compared with peeling an onion, layer by layer by layer by layer, and there's still another layer underneath. As you know, since 10 years, we have more or less standardized how we react as an organization when informed of a disaster. In a typical scenario, we immediately support the initial local response from our national society through a draft allocation. We then send out a draft bulletin, an information bulletin. The national society organizes a rapid assessment. We then launch a preliminary appeal and start drafting and implementing an initial plan of action. And that is then to be followed by a more extensive assessment, perhaps done by a fact, and that then leads up to the launch of a revised appeal. This approach was meant to obtain relevant information more quickly, thus enabling us to launch a first appeal, the preliminary one, while the disaster is still hot in the news, and to start providing services as quickly as possible. The approach has undeniably proven to be a success, but it also creates a major risk that a rapid assessment is not followed, or is not rapidly enough followed by a full-scale assessment, although a sizable response is in the meantime already being implemented in the field. You will forgive me for freely speaking my mind for once. In my opinion, a rapid assessment is never, ever a sufficient basis for defining a full-scale humanitarian response to a complex emergency. It's never sufficient for any emergency, but never, ever in case of a complex emergency. Rather, it might help to define the scope of a full assessment that must follow and that must be conducted before a real plan of action is developed. And yes, a rapid assessment can call for some immediate, life-saving or life-protecting action if such is warranted by the situation. But that action should then be understood as preliminary, open for revision and correction, just as is the case with our preliminary appeal. Same logic there. The need for having a real assessment does not delay the delivery of critical services to those in need. But it keeps that delivery flexible until those needs and working conditions are sufficiently well understood. In other words, as long as a full-scale assessment has not taken place, whatever we do should also always be seen as temporarily and as open for correction. It's not cast in stone. Complex emergencies, as you all know, usually evolve very fast, especially at their onset, and they often evolve in very surprising directions. Assessments must therefore capture the full complexity of a crisis and try to predict its possible evolutions. They will propose scenarios that must be tested on their probability and consequences. They must spell out risk and critical assumptions. It's the work of experienced sectoral teams, guided by team leaders who have dealt with complex emergencies before. It is not enough to have a highly experienced team leader who is experienced with natural disasters. Natural disasters and complex emergencies are different babies. Members must include representatives from the host national society as they best understand the culture, habits, standards, and needs of those involved. But assessment teams must also include expatriates who might raise new questions or who will challenge all too obvious answers. And of course, any assessment team must include both women and men. Let us agree that what often looks like a containable issue, a containable problem, can rapidly evolve in an outright crisis with long-term and far-reaching consequences, even for other countries. And I think we have a good example here with the Libya situation, where the departure of several hundreds of thousands of migrant workers will have long-term economic consequences, not only for Libya, but also for their own countries of return. Those long-term consequences are at least as important as the short-term needs for shelter of those in transit. A good assessment of a complex emergency will indeed need direct contact, direct questioning, direct observation to capture the immediate needs at the local level, but it will also be critical to take a wider perspective, to look at the larger and future consequences of the crisis. In fact, it is better to start an assessment by an analysis of the context than by immediately focusing on the needs. Too much, too quickly focusing on needs stirs up emotions. It triggers a reflex to respond without necessarily considering all options or consequences. Ladies and gentlemen, it's easy to create additional risk for beneficiaries, staff and volunteers by acting on emotions and impulsively responding to short-term needs. Beneficiaries, as you all know, have a variety of needs, and some of these are not immediately visible, but can become far more critical for their longer-term well-being. Covering, for example, short-term needs beyond the standards that exist within the surrounding community might rapidly create jealousy and will result in the rejection of and even violence against the beneficiaries. So trying to help can turn into a nightmare scenario where beneficiaries are singled out for having been served. Our primary goal should therefore not be to provide a rapid response. It should be to provide an adequate response. That's not necessarily the same. An adequate response will identify balances that must be respected and kept throughout. The first balance is between short and long-term needs of the beneficiaries. Another balance, equally important, is between those who directly benefit from a humanitarian intervention and those who don't benefit, but might have equal levels both of vulnerability and of needs. Rather than having one assessment, there will be a cascade of assessments, simultaneously conducted at field level, national or regional, zone levels, perhaps even beyond Geneva world level. All information obtained shall then be used to formulate options, okay, to identify the risks, to identify critical issues that need to be taken into account. The various levels will then each have their specific contribution in one cohesive approach which has to be supported by a smooth flow of information and a clear understanding of each layer's role and responsibilities. Okay? Disaster management is not a task for Geneva, it's not a task for the field, it's not a task for the zone. It's a task for all of them, but each one of them has its specific contribution to make. Ultimately, any proposed action will always be a compromise. No plan of action will ever be final or cast in stone, since we will have to adapt constantly to significant changes in the needs, changing contexts, changing working conditions, and even adapt to available resources. A monitoring system must therefore be developed, resourced, and managed to ensure that relevant changes are captured and that the intervention adapts quickly and appropriately. So much for assessment. If you have more questions afterwards, we can discuss that for the rest of the day because it's a very interesting topic. As became clear when I discussed the genesis of this operation, other actors had already started to respond to the crisis before the Federation even arrived. From the start, the Federation had thus the choice either to commit its resources to strengthening, for example, SUSHA, for example, by taking charge of one or more service sectors, or instead to construct a parallel setup, either to offload some of the pressure on SUSHA, or to create additional space for refugees if their numbers would grow beyond the capacity to deal with at SUSHA. It's a choice we often have. Shall we rather cooperate and strengthen the existing, or rather go our own way and provide an alternative to what others are doing? While the question might seem obvious to answer, in fact it is not. And there's quite a lot of considerations that come into play before we take a decision. Some of the questions are, who are the other actors? Is their effort compatible with our fundamental principles and, for example, the code of conduct for humanitarian actors? Are those actors neutral and impartial, and are they perceived as such by the beneficiaries and by other stakeholders? Are they professional? Are they committed? Are they open to a coordinated approach or not? Are they, in short, part of the solution, or perhaps rather part of the problem? Is the existing effort appropriate in view of the short and longer term needs of the beneficiaries? Does the effort need to be expanded in scope or volume? And does it make sense for us to do so? And if so, does it then make more sense to add an extension to the existing structure, or is it perhaps better to replicate and improve the effort elsewhere? The above questions, and again it's only a few, should be addressed before taking a decision on how to position ourselves. But it should be part of a very early reflection before we go into drafting any response plan. Let's reflect on the Tunisia operation. There would have been tremendous value in supporting UNHCR in getting the situation under control at SUSHA, rather than in opening a camp that was designed with an overflow in mind, which was not likely to happen overnight. By the way, it has never happened. But then again, doing so would have sustained an approach that did not seem to acknowledge the complexity of the beneficiaries. Indeed, the beneficiaries represented an explosive mix of distinct groups with different backgrounds, different cultures and religions. That mix certainly required a very different approach than the blanket approach that was taken at SUSHA. So there were arguments to say we could support, there were arguments to say it would be better to come up with another solution. Actually, the discussion regarding the complex nature of the beneficiaries was held, but late in the process, and it then led to a concerted decision to redefine the purpose of all camps, including the Hayet and UAE camps. These camps, both managed by Red Cross family, these camps would no longer wait for a mass influx. In other words, they would not remain overflow camps, but rather immediately start accommodating each a different group of nationalities, thus leading to a far more homogeneous population in each of the camps. Instead of having 30 nationalities at SUSHA, you would have 10 with the Red Cross or with the UAE, 10 with the Federation, and another 10 with UNHCR. So you would be able to divide cultures and nationalities that have problems between and amongst themselves. Moreover, by absorbing a sizable portion of the new arrivals, pressure would be taken from Susha, providing UNHCR with the space and calm that was needed to reorganize its camp. If that discussion would have taken place earlier, and it would have if the assessment had been more thorough, then the construction of the 3 camps could have happened in a better balanced way, avoiding the wild growth of one difficult-to-control super camp with 2 much smaller, better equipped, better organized, but completely empty satellites at close distance. The overall risks to beneficiaries at Susha would have been better contained from the very start. It would have served everybody, actors and beneficiaries. Ladies and gentlemen, the purpose of this Red Talk is not to second guess why things went the way they did. The purpose is also not to criticize. The point is to stress that we almost always have the opportunity to strengthen the existing, and this from the assessment phase on. Aren't we too quick in deciding that we need our own assessment, our own plans, our own appeal, and our own response, while there are other and at times better options? Isn't this something that has to be brought up again during future disaster management and other fact trainings? One other critical issue from a cost management point of view is the importance of planning for the end of an operation. While I believe that we have a fairly good understanding of what it takes to decide that an intervention is justified and needed, it seems that we continue to struggle when it comes to phasing out an operation. And personally, I'm convinced that the decision to phase out only becomes more difficult as time passes. It is the exceptional level or the exceptional nature of needs that triggers off a humanitarian intervention. The exceptional character is then well understood and often already documented in the assessment reports. But as an operation evolves, that exceptional character is slowly brought under control. This allows the quality and scope of services to improve, and gradually standards start to rise. Implementers, ladies and gentlemen, are very proud of their work. They are real professionals. And they do witness very physically, very directly, the result of their work on beneficiaries. They see the effect of what they do. It motivates them to do more, to do better, and to reach further. And if left on their own, they will end up, over time, providing a level and quality of service that is not available anywhere else in the world. But that is a level that cannot be sustained in the future. At that point, an intervention becomes problematic. It starts to create dependency, and it creates unrealistic and unjustified expectations toward existing structural public systems. It must then be either corrected or even stopped. To avoid this from happening, planners should define the indicators that will trigger, and I would say almost automatically as a reflex process, the phase out of individual services or of the intervention as a whole. The best time to do so, to define these indicators, is at the very start of an operation, since then the comparison of what are exceptional needs as compared to acceptable, better than pre-existing levels of needs is still easy to make. It goes without saying that such a comparison includes both quantitative and qualitative dimensions, but it also goes without saying that it has to be done very early in the process. Dear friends, Hayet's occupancy is now down to 30% of its capacity. A couple of weeks ago, it served as few as 200 beneficiaries per day, but it's a massive investment. Susha is today at 15 to 20% of its 20,000 capacity. And then you still have to add the UAE unspent capacity. There is an empty capacity at the border with Libya for more than 20,000 people to come. So I believe it's time to phase out Hayet. To close it down without leaving loose ends for the TRCS, the beneficiaries, and the other humanitarian partners involved. It's time to leave. Lastly, I'd briefly like to mention the issue of approaching a complex emergency in a way that is comparable to how modern computers work today. For those that are as old as me, after the Commodores, you remember those? The 286s, the 386s, the 486s, and the whole range of Pentiums, we now have the breakthrough of the multiprocessor, multi-core, multi-threading monsters that eagerly devour the massive tasks we throw at them. Ladies and gentlemen, their strength doesn't as much lie in the size or the core speed of their processors. It does lie in the way they reduce a complex task into a series of simple, interlinked tasks, which are then distributed to the various threads and cores at their disposal at the same time and in a highly coordinated way. I believe that we must continue to promote and support a similar approach in responding to emergency. One could think of the various humanitarian organizations as processors. And a processor, they are independent components, fully independent. You can take them by hand separately from all the rest of the components you have, fully independent, just as we like to be. But they are fitted on one and the same motherboard that interlinks them and gives them their purpose, which is to solve a complex problem in a coordinated way. Think of international humanitarian organizations seeing themselves as processors interlinked on one and the same motherboard. Each processor has today a number of cores. In our case, the cores represent the Geneva Secretariat, the zone, the regional and country offices, the global response tools, but also all of the national societies that are responding to one and the same emergency. And each of those cores has the ability to multi-thread. It is to process data and to provide solutions in a semi-autonomous way that contributes to the overall effort simultaneously, but in a coordinated way. You get one large, coordinated framework within which a lot of processes are happening, managed by more or less autonomously acting actors. Difficult, eh? I guess that what I'm trying to say is that computers have gone a long way since my very first old Atari. So too have many humanitarian organizations since the days when we were all lone actors, flag-flying competitors that were utterly allergic to any coordination efforts, even and especially so when it was about coordination amongst ourselves. I fundamentally believe that we are becoming a multi-processing system to the benefit of those we serve. But, ladies and gentlemen, often the motherboard is still weak or altogether lacking. In the Tunisia Operation, both multilateral and bilateral responses had a place. All types of global response tools, the FACT, emergency response units, RDRTs were deployed. They all planned and worked closely together with the volunteers and leadership of the TRCS. That in itself is a real achievement. I would like to thank the colleagues and friends at all levels who have made this happen. And I really would like to thank you for all of your attention. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I don't know about your Atari. I can barely keep up with my iPad and my BlackBerry and all those people who are tweeting in, commenting on what you are saying. So we had lots of interesting tweets. People have picked up certain points. And those who are twittering, is it the right word? Tweeting? Yes. Tweeting. Please carry on tweeting and send us your comments and we can ask Roger directly. And also anyone online. So the floor is open.
Thanks a lot for your talk. It was really interesting. I just had a question. You mentioned that if assessments had been more thorough, certain situations could have been avoided. And you gave the example of the camps. And I was wondering if there were any other gaps in assessment that you saw in Tunisia while you were there.
The assessment, did it leave gaps? Yes, sure. And let me be very clear, I'm not talking about gaps in the federation assessment. but gaps in the overall assessment by all actors on the spot. Okay, what actually happened, and it's a situation that happens often, is that since the beneficiaries were already there, as soon as one arrived, he was drawn into a process of looking at needs and feeling obliged to immediately respond to those. Okay, so what happened is that slowly the focus people had was getting narrower and narrower. And by doing so, in fact, people forgot to look at many issues. Okay, very obviously, if you remember what I've said, the camp at the largest distance from the border is only at 8.5 to 9 kilometers. Okay, there's an internationally accepted standard that normally camps are put at 1 day walking distance from a border or at 50 kilometers, for example. Okay, that is much too close. For your information, further down south in the country, there's another border point where people started to cross and they set up their own wild camp. Okay, and that was attacked. Okay, and it was at a shorter distance, but shorter than 8 kilometers is hardly possible. So that's one of the issues which was not picked up rapidly enough. Another thing was the feeling of the local community or their position within this overall conflict. I mean, this is a border town. It lives from border trade. Okay, many of the people had relatives at the other side of the border. Some of them were pro-opposition. Many of them were pro-Gaddafi. Okay, and we actually got quite a number of security incidents which we could have foreseen if ever we would have taken the time to discuss more with the local population. Another thing we didn't pick up is that amongst the returnees, migrant workers, a lot of them were Tunisian, okay, and many of them from the border area. Okay, so in a situation where there was already high levels of young unemployment, in a country that just came out of a revolution that upsets the economy, with newly arriving people who again are unemployed, the issue of unemployment would have to become a real issue for the humanitarian workers. I mean, simply speaking, many of the unemployed just assumed that the humanitarian actors would compensate for the loss of work by hiring them all. And it's a problem that persists today and was not well dealt with. And I've hinted, for example, at the element, at the issue of beneficiaries. I mean, people just assumed that the beneficiary is a beneficiary. Okay? As if a woman arriving at the border is the same thing as a man arriving at the border, and a man is a man, and a family is an individual, and a nation is an Arabic, and an Arabic is an African, etc., etc. Okay? There is no such a thing as a bulk beneficiary. Okay? Those are individuals with their own needs. Okay? Now, you can't serve 10,000 people individually, but at least you have to see whether there is relevant distinctions that have to be taken into account, which didn't happen. Okay, so those are some of the gaps. There is more, okay, but those are crucial gaps, I think. Another thing is that the situation was almost seen as a static situation. There are refugees and we have to deal with them. Okay, don't forget that 2 weeks later, there was the UN resolution, the Security Council resolution, that brought into play NATO. I mean, the force of power in Libya was swapping the whole time. It is still swapping. Okay, in the days the camp opened, the move was from Libya to Tunisia. Then a couple of days later, the balance of power was switched, and it seemed as if everybody was going to go into Egypt. And then a few days later, when NATO intervened, the power balance went back to Tunisia. And you know that in the meantime, Gaddafi started an offensive that went again to the east, and today it's back to the west. Okay, so it's very important not to identify a situation as a static situation, essential for a complex emergency, as it's fundamentally unpredictable, it's highly fluid, it's highly dynamic.
Roger, you assume that it is a complex operation. Isn't it an intervention which defines? Your presentation gave me an impression that you already knew it's a very complex operation. So is there no preliminary deployment necessary just to assess whether it is? Or would you assume that it will be?
In a way, I'm not saying it's a complex operation. What I'm saying is that it's an operation in response to a complex emergency. Okay, what is a complex emergency? It's an emergency that happens within a context of instability. Okay, so for example, you have a natural disaster in a country where there is already civil disorder. Okay, so the structure of order of decision making is deeply affected, and then on top of it you get another crisis. That is what is happening here. Tunisia just went through a major revolution. It has got rid of a regime that controlled it for 23 years. Imagine how firmly anchored all the structures were. But also imagine if that regime implodes or explodes, whatever you want to call it. Imagine the consequence on those structures and the consequence for stability. Still, elections have to be held. It still has to be seen where Tunisia is going to tomorrow. But in the meantime, things are happening. The police force was actively in hiding because you know that many of them were perceived as being too closely linked to the former regime. And the military, they had an interest in keeping a very low visibility. No one wanted to further upset the population. So when there was mass demonstrations, for example, no one really controlled them. Okay, so the security of our team was constantly at risk in a way, okay, because of that situation. That's the situation inside Tunisia, and then on top of that, you get an event that is uncontrolled, uncontrollable, unpredictable. Okay, that's what makes a complex emergency. Okay, and within that, this operation then took place. You see what I'm saying? So it's less about a complex operation. It's much more about a complex emergency, a complex environment to work in. Most of what I have said is also valid for natural disasters, but it's much more valid when you talk about a complex emergency. Okay, because many more political factors are at play. Security becomes a very different issue. Much more is hidden, much more is unknown than in terms of a natural disaster.
Martin Fisher from the Sphere Project. I just wanted to ask, with so many different communities, you said 30 different communities, how did you go about consulting with them about their individual needs?
The real honest answer is that no one did. That's the real honest answer. What happened is that slowly camp management in the various camps started to consult with those beneficiaries that made most noise. Okay, so they were forced in a dialogue with beneficiaries because they started to protest. Okay, and again that follows the fact that the assessment had not been sufficiently done. Okay, the better an assessment, the less you will have these problems throughout the operation. Those of you who believe that an assessment is a loss of time, they don't understand that every day you lose with an assessment, and it's only few, but every day you lose, you get it back tenfold later on in the operation. Okay, and it makes it much more relevant what you are doing, much more appropriate what you are doing, much more safe for your own people, and much more safe for the beneficiaries. Hence, it's highly important.
Who was the first on the scene to respond when people started crossing the border?
By definition, the Tunisian military, because they are the one protecting the border. Hence, the Tunisian authority, which means the Tunisian military, civil protection, Ministry of Health, intervened immediately, and very rapidly. Red Cross got involved in that process, very rapidly. Local volunteers, not necessarily well coordinated, but they were part of the initial response. And then, quite fast, UNHCR and the whole international circus.
Great. Any last one or two questions? Yeah, please.
Anita Shah from the BBC World Service Trust. You did mention, Roger, that communities weren't consulted about their needs, but at a later stage, did the agencies communicate effectively with affected populations in terms of information provision about the crisis, what had just happened, what the risks and threats that they faced were, how they could mitigate those risks, and interventions and assistance that was forthcoming? And secondly, in terms of feedback from communities, in terms of questions that they may have, comments that they may have, or complaints and appeals?
Yes, it's definitely true that throughout the process, the contact with beneficiaries, not only beneficiaries, but also with the surrounding community became better and better. Again, not so much at the initiative of the international actors, but more at the initiative of the local communities, because they protested, because they demonstrated, because at one point they were perceived as a threat, but that definitely improved. With the beneficiaries, definitely, I mean, the fact of not putting them all together in one camp anymore, but splitting them out over 3 camps, of course, already made that communities felt closer to each other and that it was easier to have a contact with them because you were dealing with a group where there is no acute tension, okay, where they are not infighting, okay, so definitely there, but also with the community, and there, just for your information, quite a lot of efforts were done, including by our own security people. Quite a lot of efforts were done to identify within Ben Gerdan, which was the local community nearby, to identify who were key actors, key decision makers, not formal ones, but the ones who in reality determine how a population responds to something, reacts to something, to identify them and to have long discussions with them, to explain them what we were doing, how we were doing it, what we could accommodate of what they wanted and what we could not accommodate. Okay, so the eternal question was, for example, to hire more local staff, but you cannot hire more local staff than you have beneficiaries, of course. There's a limit to what you can do, but at least explaining that process and sitting down with them to discuss the recruitment process does really reduce some of the stress. Don't believe in fairy tales. I mean, it's never solved, but at least there was major progress happening on that. And the feedback of the communities, yes, it was heard, it was listened to, and it is taken into the planning. For example, local communities have reminded us that there where we built camps, before this was a grazing area for camels and for goats, okay? And they convince us of the need, when we phase out, to make sure that that terrain is brought back in its initial condition and is not reduced to a sand field, a desert plot, as it is today. So yes, there is an existing discussion. Yes, it has improved over time. My point was more to say that should be done early in the process. It should be part of the assessment. It should not wait until we get tensions with the community.
Hi, my name is William Carter. I'm here in the Watsan unit. I think other than Benoit, I'm probably the only person in the room that was there in that first week. I know you said you didn't want to second guess or criticize, but I think a lot of your statements have been just that. Quite a few of them, I think, have been a little bit unfair. I won't go through all of them, but I think saying that we thought that the situation was static was completely untrue. Thinking that we took every beneficiary as the same as well. As far as static, we knew that there was a risk that we would build up a huge camp and that it might remain empty. But we thought that risk was worth taking, given that had we left and then people had crossed, the disaster that would have been. So we knew full well. I would also say that your statistics about the camp being full are inaccurate as of the day before yesterday. Shusha camp was attacked by local gangs. 80% of the tents were burned to the ground, and now our camp is receiving the refugees that were driven into the desert and spent the night there. So it was a dynamic situation then. It is now. I won't stand up for the whole group and say that no mistakes were made, but saying that we didn't do a full assessment, saying that we didn't, that we made wrong assumptions, that it would be static and things like that, is a bit unfair, a criticism of the team. Thanks.
Okay, well, William, very sorry. Of course, if one criticizes what has happened before him, he's bound to have some strong argument with the people who were there. And I really would appreciate if we can sit down afterwards and hammer some of those issues out. The points I'm trying to make is that you have to look at the whole overall situation, okay? I understand that at one point a decision was made to make an overflow camp, fearing that there would be a mass influx of people. Okay, but 3 weeks into the operation, when I arrived, there was enough tents for 600 people with a maximum potential of going up to 2,000. Okay, and that would have filled the whole compound, the whole plot. Okay, you have to wonder how relevant would that have been as an overflow contingency. While in the same time, a camp was in deep trouble already, and while in the same time, beneficiaries were treated, and again, I didn't say by the Federation or by the Red Cross, but at Susha camp as bulk beneficiaries. That's what I said. Okay, so we had a choice. We always have a choice. We can continue to plan for the ultimate contingency, or we can try to strengthen what is already going wrong and deeply wrong at that time. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay, it's a choice to be made. Okay, it has been made. It has been changed afterwards. Okay, that's the point. Secondly, the issue that in the meantime there has been a fire at Susha, and that therefore the camp all at once gets its purpose of an overflow. That happened way after I'd been there, so sorry for that. I didn't even pick that up, to be honest. So okay, that gives an additional purpose to the camp. But that was not the reason why the camp was built. Okay? And that highlights far more remaining issues to be addressed in terms of the safety at, for example, Susha camp, then it picks up the issue of how we plan our organization. Okay? Susha had a warning a week ago when only few camps burned down. Okay, so it's sad to hear that now 80%, you said, of the tents were burned. That's a terrible issue. Again, the question is, could we have avoided it by strengthening that camp instead of having a separate structure which can today provide shelter to 1,200 people? Okay, that's what I'm saying. For the rest, by all means, let's have a good discussion because I still have a lot of open questions on what happened in the past.
Thank you, Roger. I'm Jerry Lau with the Youth Action and Volunteering Development Department. Just wanting to highlight, you mentioned about volunteers, and we focus a lot about volunteers in emergencies and more in natural disasters in that context. But you brought some very important points on how do we prepare volunteers for these complexities and what you felt about that, and the support by the National Society towards the volunteers. And what can we do for learnings to be more, what would you say, ready in the future to support volunteers in this capacity? Thank you.
I mean, that's a real tricky angle because you have to look at Tunisia before this emergency and at Tunisia in a normal state, I would say. Tunisia is actually a well-developed country, okay, where the Red Cross is more or less developing as in most of Northern Europe. Okay, and if you look at most of Northern Europe, the responsibility for emergency management, disaster management, is actually no longer operationally with the Red Cross, but is well with the government and the authorities. So they normally deal fully with that situation. And what then is asked from the Red Cross is often social support. It's often support to reception centers. It's short-term, more soft support than the real search and rescue, hard technical issues of disaster management. So that the National Society did not really invest in this kind of training can be understood from the overall context. I don't think anything is wrong with that, as long as we do have an international system that knows how to back them up rapidly if something happens, okay? So, yes, many of the volunteers were unprepared for this, but which should be expected if it would happen in Belgium or in France or in many places in Western Europe. Yes, a lot of support was needed, and that's okay with me. There are lessons learned. There are also golden opportunities now. I mean, this operation leaves behind in Tunisia a lot of skills and experience, and it also leaves behind a lot of equipment. What we have advised the National Society is to make a choice of where they want to take this to. Okay, it would be wrong if tomorrow they would decide to have their own FACT and 7 ERUs and 10 different sectoral units. It would be wise if they would say, we will focus on constituting 1 or 2 ERUs with the full equipment we have and with the experience we have gained in view of what is relevant longer term for our country. So that is happening. Okay, but before that, then one element I also would like to add is that when I said that the country to a certain extent was destabilized by the revolution, I think we should also be fair and understand that the Red Cross also has suffered some of the effects of what has happened. Okay, and that in a way there are also internal processes ongoing that make that picking up longer term development again and defining strategically where to go to might take a couple of weeks, but is an interesting process which we should support further. Mm-hmm.
Roger, thank you very much indeed. I think you, through your very thoughtful observations, raised a number of challenges and questions. Certainly, I think we have to be very honest in self-appraisal, as well as learn the lessons from these unusual experiences. And in a context of a changing world, I think it opens up the debate about our operating models, our assumptions, but our presumptions. And certainly it's important that humanitarian action is not something that humanitarians do to those in crisis. It is something that those who are within those crises have every right, and in this modern world, they must have a stake in doing that. I think those and other lessons, I think you captured in your narrative. What we will do, the written version of his talk, we will circulate from RedTalk to all concerned. And Edith would like to share a token of her appreciation with you. Go.
On behalf of all of us, thank you very much for your enlightening and informative talk. And to show our appreciation, this is a small token for you.
With or without the kisses?
I think without this time.
Red.
Thank you.
Thank you.